1. The problem of knowledge and the problem of ethics. Hume proposes the creation of a science of humanity, but what is really his fundamental project? A choice is always defined in terms of what it excludes, and a historical project is a logical substitution. Hume's project entails the substitution of a psychology of the mind by a psychology of the mind's affections. The constitution of a psychology of the mind is not at all possible, since this psychology cannot find in its object the required constancy or universality. Only a psychology of affections will be capable of constituting the true science of humanity. In this sense, Hume is a moralist and a sociologist before being a psychologist. The treatise shows that the two forms under which the mind is affected are essentially the passional and the social. They imply each other, assuring thereby the unity of the object of an authentic science. On the one hand, society demands and expects from each one of its members the display of constant reactions, the presence of passions able to provide motives and ends, and the availability of collective or individual characters. A prince who imposes a tax upon his subjects expects their compliance. On the other hand, the passions implicate society as the oblique means for their satisfaction. In the last analysis, the coherence of the passional and the social in history is revealed as an internal unity, with political organization and the institutions giving history its objects. History studies the relations between motive and action in most circumstances, and it also exhibits the uniformity of the human passions. In brief, the option of the psychologist may be expressed paradoxically as follows. One must be a moralist, sociologist, or historian before being a psychologist, in order to be a psychologist. Here, the project of the human sciences reaches the condition which would make knowledge in general possible. The mind must be affected. By itself and in itself, the mind is not nature. It is not the object of science. Hence the question which will preoccupy Hume is this: how does the mind become human nature? Passional and social affection are only a part of human nature. There are also the understanding and the association of ideas. The fact is, though, that this list is still based on convention. The real role of the understanding, says Hume, is to make the passion sociable and the interest social. The understanding reflects interest. On the other hand, nothing prevents us from thinking of it as something distinct, the way the physicist fragments a movement, while recognizing all along that it is indivisible and non-composite. We should not, in fact, forget that two points of view coexist in Hume. The passions and the understanding present themselves in a way which must be made clear as two distinct parts. By itself, though, the understanding is only the process of the passions on their way to socialization. Sometimes we see that the understanding and the passions constitute two separate problems, but at other times we see that the understanding is subordinated to the passions. This is the reason why, even when studied separately, the understanding must, above all, help us to understand better the general sense of the above question. Hume constantly affirms the identity between the mind, the imagination, and ideas. The mind is not nature, nor does it have a nature. It is identical with the ideas in the mind. Ideas are given. As given, they are experience. The mind, on the other hand, is given as a collection of ideas and not as a system. It follows that our earlier question can be expressed as follows: how does a collection become a system? The collection of ideas is called imagination, insofar as the collection designates not a faculty, but rather an assemblage of things in the most vague sense of the term. Things are as they appear, a collection without an album, a play without a stage, a flux of perceptions. The comparison of the theatre must not mislead us, nor have we the most distant notion of the place where these scenes are represented, or of the materials of which it is composed. The place is not different from what takes place in it. The representation does not take place in a subject. Then again, the question may be, how does the mind become a subject? How does the imagination become a faculty? It is true, Hume constantly reiterates, that ideas are in the imagination, but the preposition here does not signify inherence in a subject. Rather, the use of the preposition is metaphorical, and it means to exclude from the mind an activity which would be distinct from the movement of ideas. It means to ensure the identity between the mind and the ideas in the mind. The preposition signifies that imagination is not a factor, an agent, or a determining determination. It is a place which must be localized, that is to say, fixed, something determinable. Nothing is done by the imagination. Everything is done in the imagination. It is not even a faculty for forming ideas, because the production of an idea by the imagination is only the reproduction of an impression in the imagination. Certainly the imagination has its own activity, but even this activity, being whimsical and delirious, is without constancy and without uniformity. It is the movement of ideas and the totality of their actions and reactions. Being the place of ideas, the fancy is the collection of separate individual items. Being the bond of ideas, it moves through the universe, engendering fire dragons, winged horses, and monstrous giants. The depth of the mind is indeed delirium, or, same thing from another point of view, change and indifference. By itself, the imagination is not nature, it is a mere fancy. There is no constancy or uniformity in the ideas that I have. No more is there constancy or uniformity in the way in which ideas are connected through the imagination. Only chance makes up this connection. The generality of the idea is not a characteristic of the idea. It does not belong to the imagination. Rather than being the nature of some idea, it is a role which every idea can play under the influence of other principles. What are these other principles? How does the imagination become human nature? Constancy and uniformity are present only in the way in which ideas are associated in the imagination. Association, with its three principles, contiguity, resemblance, and causality, transcends the imagination and also differs from it. Association affects the imagination. Rather than finding its origin, association finds in the imagination its term and its object. It is a quality which unifies ideas, not a quality of ideas themselves. As we will see, through belief and causality, the subject transcends the given. Literally, the subject goes beyond what the mind gives it. I believe in what I have neither seen nor touched, but the subject can go beyond the given because, first of all, it is inside the mind, the effect of principles transcending and affecting the mind. Before there can be belief, all three principles of association must organize the given into a system, imposing constancy on the imagination. The latter does not draw its own resources from constancy, but without it, it would never be human nature. These principles attribute to ideas the links and principles of union, which, instead of being the characteristics of ideas, are the original qualities of human nature. The privilege that causality enjoys is that it alone can make us affirm existence and make us believe. It confers upon the idea of the object a solidity and an objectivity that this idea would not have had it only been associated through contiguity or resemblance to an actual impression. But the other two principles also share with causality a common role. They fix and naturalize the mind. They prepare belief and accompany it. We can now see the special ground of empiricism. Nothing in the mind transcends human nature, because it is human nature that, in its principles, transcends the mind. Nothing is ever transcendental. Association, far from being a product, is a rule of the imagination and a manifestation of its free exercise. It guides the imagination, gives it uniformity, and also constrains it. In this sense, ideas are connected in the mind, not by the mind. The imagination is indeed human nature, but only to the extent that other principles have made it constant and settled. There is a difficulty, though, even with this definition. Why is regulated imagination, rather than the rule grasped in its active power, human nature? How can we say of the imagination that it becomes a nature, despite the fact that it has not within itself a reason for this becoming? The answer is simple. Essentially, principles refer to the mind which they affect, but nature refers to the imagination. Its entire function is to qualify the imagination. Association is a law of nature, and, like every other law, it is defined by its effects, not by a cause. Similarly, on an entirely different plane, God may be called cause, and pre-established harmony or teleology may be fruitfully invoked. The conclusion of the dialogues, the essay on miracles, and the essay on immortality are in fact coherent. A cause may always be thought as something in itself, transcending all the analogies which provide it with a determined content, in the case of experience and knowledge. But the fact is that philosophy, being a human science, need not search for the cause. It should rather scrutinize effects. The cause cannot be known. Principles have neither cause nor an origin of their power. What is original is their effect upon the imagination. The effect of association appears in three ways. Sometimes the idea takes on a role and becomes capable of representing all these ideas with which, through resemblance, it is associated. General idea. At other times, the union of ideas brought about by the mind acquires a regularity not previously had, in which case nature in a manner points out to every one those simple ideas, which are most proper to be united into a complex one. Substance and mode. Finally, sometimes one idea can introduce another, relation. The result of the association in all three cases is the mind's easy passage from one idea to another, so that the essence of relations becomes precisely this easy transition. The mind, having become nature, has acquired now a tendency. But despite the fact that nature makes reference to ideas, to the extent that it associates them in the mind, the ideas do not acquire a new quality of their own, nor are they capable of attributing it to their objects. No new ideas ever appear. Ideas are related in a uniform way, but those relations are not the object of an idea. Hume, in fact, observes that general ideas must be represented, but only in the fancy, under the form of a particular idea having a determined quantity and quality. On the one hand, the imagination cannot become in itself nature without being for itself the fancy. As for the fancy, it finds here an entirely new extension. The fancy can always invoke relations, borrow the clothing of nature, and form general rules, going beyond the determined field of legitimate knowledge, and carrying knowledge beyond its proper limits. It can display its own fancies. The Irish cannot be witty, the French cannot have solidity. In order to wipe out the effect of these extensive rules, and in order to consolidate knowledge, we will need the application of different rules, this time the application of corrective rules. Albeit less fancifully, the imagination, whenever faced with a relation, will not fail to double and reinforce it by means of other relations, however unmerited they may be. On the other hand, the mind cannot be activated by the principles of nature without remaining passive. It only suffers the effects. Relations are not doing the connecting, but rather they themselves are connected. Causality, for example, is passion, an impression of reflection, and a resemblance effect. Causality is felt. It is a perception of the mind and not a conclusion of the understanding. We must not here be content with saying that the idea of cause and effect arises from objects constantly united, but must affirm that 'tis the very same with the idea of these objects. In short, the necessary relation is indeed in the subject, but only insofar as the subject contemplates. This is the reason why Hume sometimes, on the negative side, insists on the paradox of his thesis, and at other times, on the positive side, he emphasizes its orthodoxy. Insofar as necessity is on the side of the subject, the necessary relation, in the case of things, is only a constant conjunction. Necessity is indeed only that. But necessity belongs to the subject only insofar as the subject contemplates, and not insofar as it acts. The constant conjunction is the entire necessary relation. For Hume, the determination is not determining, it is rather determined. When Hume speaks of an act of the mind, of a disposition, he does not mean to say that the mind is active, but that it is activated and that it has become subject. The coherent paradox of Hume's philosophy is that it offers a subjectivity which transcends itself, without being any less passive. Subjectivity is determined as an effect. It is, in fact, an impression of reflection. The mind, having been affected by the principles, turns now into a subject. Nature cannot be studied scientifically except in terms of its effects upon the mind, yet the only true science of the mind should have nature as its object. Human nature is the only science of man. This, of course, means that the psychology of affections disallows any psychology of the mind, but it also means that affections give the mind its qualities. A certain ambiguity may well be explained in this way. In Hume's work, we witness the unequal development of two lines of diverse inspiration. On the one hand, the psychology of the mind is a psychology of ideas, of simple elements, of minima or indivisibles. It occupies essentially the second part of the system of the understanding, the ideas of space and time. This is Hume's atomism. On the other hand, the psychology of human nature is a psychology of dispositions, perhaps even an anthropology, a science of practice, especially morality, politics, and history. It is finally a real critique of psychology, insofar as it locates the reality of its object in all the determinations not given in an idea, or in all the qualities transcending the mind. The second line of inspiration constitutes Hume's associationism, and to confuse associationism with atomism is a curious misunderstanding. Now we are faced with the question, why does the first inspiration subsist in Hume's writings, especially in his theory of space? We have seen that, although the psychology of affections contains in its project the critique and even the elimination of a psychology of the mind, as a science impossible to constitute, it nevertheless contains in its object an essential reference to the mind as the objective of natural qualifications. Since the mind is in itself a collection of atoms, a true psychology is neither immediately nor directly possible. The principles do not make the mind an object of possible science, without first giving it an objective nature. Hume, therefore, does not create an atomistic psychology. He rather indicates inside atomism a state of the mind which does not permit any psychology. We cannot reproach Hume for having neglected the important problem of the conditions of the human sciences. We might even wonder whether modern authors do not repeat Hume's philosophical project when they associate an assiduous critique of atomism with every positive movement of the human sciences. It would follow that they treat atomism less as a historical localized thesis and more as the general schema of what psychology cannot be. They condemn it, therefore, in the name of the concrete rights of ethology and sociology, or of the passional and the social. The intellect, said Comte, with respect to impossible psychologies, is almost exclusively the subject of their speculations, and the affections have been almost entirely neglected, and, moreover, always subordinated to the understanding. The whole of human nature is thus very unfaithfully represented by these futile systems. All serious writers agree on the impossibility of a psychology of the mind. This is why they criticize so meticulously every single identification between consciousness and knowledge. They differ only in the way they determine the factors which give a nature to the mind. Sometimes these factors are the body and matter, in which case psychology makes room for physiology. Sometimes they are particular principles, constituting a psychic equivalent of matter, wherein psychology finds its unique possible object and its scientific condition. Hume, with his principles of association, has chosen the latter route, which is the most difficult and the most audacious. This is where his sympathy for materialism comes from, and at the same time his reticence toward it. Until now, we have shown only that the task that Hume's philosophy sets for itself is to answer the question, how does the mind become a nature? But why is it this one? The question must be taken up on a different plane. Hume's problem would then be exclusively about a fact, and therefore empirical. Quid facti? What is the fact of knowledge? It is transcendence, or going beyond. I affirm more than I know. My judgment goes beyond the idea. In other words, I am a subject. I say, Caesar is dead, the sun will rise tomorrow, Rome exists. I speak in general terms and I have beliefs. I establish relations. This is a fact and a practice. In the case of knowledge, where is the fact? The fact is that these practices cannot be expressed in the form of an idea without the idea becoming immediately contradictory. Take, for example, the incompatibility between a general or abstract idea and the nature of an idea, or between a real relation between objects and the objects to which we apply the relation. The more immediate or immediately decided the incompatibility is, the more decisive it will be. Hume does not reach this point after a long discussion. He begins with it, so that the point about the contradiction assumes naturally the role of a basic challenge. This is the only relation between the philosopher and the others inside the system of the understanding. Show me the idea you claim to have. What's at stake is the challenge in the very psychology of mind. In fact, the given and experience have now two inverse meanings. The given is the idea as it is given in the mind, without anything transcending it, not even the mind, which is therefore identical with the idea. But the transcendence itself is also given in an altogether different sense and manner. It is given as practice, as an affection of the mind, and as an impression of reflection. Passion, says Hume, does not have to be defined. By the same token, belief is a je ne sais quoi adequately felt by everyone. Empirical subjectivity is constituted in the mind under the influence of principles affecting it. The mind, therefore, does not have the characteristics of a pre-existing subject. True psychology, that is, the psychology of affections, will be duplicated in each one of its moments by means of a critique of the false psychology of the mind. The latter is in fact incapable of grasping without contradiction the constitutive element of human reality. But why is it finally necessary that philosophy undertake this critique, express the transcendence in an idea, produce the contradiction, and manifest the incompatibility as the fact of knowledge? It is because the transcendence under discussion is not given in an idea, but is rather referred to the mind. It qualifies the mind. The mind is, at the same time, the object of a critique and the term of a necessary reference. The necessity of the critique is located here. This is the reason why, with respect to questions of the understanding, Hume's method is always the same. It goes from the absence of an idea in the mind to the presence of an affection of the mind. The negation of the idea of a thing affirms the identity between the character of this thing and the nature of an impression of reflection. This is the case with existence, general ideas, necessary connection, the self, and also vice and virtue. In all these cases, instead of negating the criterion of the idea, we follow the negation of the idea itself to serve as a criterion. Transcendence is first and foremost understood in its negative relation to that which it transcends. Conversely, in the structures of transcendence, the mind finds a kind of positivity which comes to it from outside. But then, how can we reconcile this entire method with Hume's principle, according to which all ideas derive from a corresponding impression, and consequently, every given impression is reproduced in an idea which perfectly represents it? If, for example, necessity is an impression of reflection, there must necessarily be an idea of necessity. Critique, says Hume, does not deprive the idea of necessary connection of its sense. It only destroys its improper applications. There certainly is an idea of necessity, but basically we speak of an impression of reflection, whenever the necessary relation is the mind affected and determined, in certain circumstances, by the idea of an object to form the idea of another object. The impression of necessity, because it is a qualification of the mind, would not be able to produce the idea as a quality of things. The proper role of the impressions of reflection, being effects of the principles, is to qualify in various ways the mind as subject. Affections then unveil the idea of subjectivity. The term idea can no longer have the same meaning. Consequently, the psychology of affections becomes the philosophy of the constituted subject. Rationalism has lost this philosophy. Hume's philosophy is a sharp critique of representation. It does not elaborate a critique of relations, but rather a critique of representation, precisely because representations cannot present relations. By making representation into a criterion, and by placing ideas within reason, rationalism expects ideas to stand for something which cannot be constituted within experience, or be given in an idea without contradiction. The generality of the idea, the existence of the object, and the content of the terms always, universal, necessary, and true. Rationalism has transferred mental determinations to external objects, taking away thereby from philosophy the meaning and the intelligibility of practice and of the subject. The fact is, though, that the mind is not reason. Reason is an affection of the mind. In this sense, reason will be called instinct, habit, or nature. We have found reason to be nothing but a general, calm determination of the passions, founded on some distant view or reflection. Reason is a kind of feeling. Consequently, just as the method of philosophy goes from the absence of an idea to the presence of an impression, similarly, the theory of reason moves also from a kind of skepticism to a kind of positivism. It moves from a skepticism of reason to a positivism of feeling, in which case the latter includes reason as a reflection of feeling in the qualified mind. In the same way that a distinction is made between atomism and associationism, a distinction must also be made between the two senses of the term idea, and therefore the two senses of the term impression. In one sense, we do not have the idea of necessity, but in another, we do. Despite the texts which present simultaneously and render homogeneous as much as possible the impressions of sensation and the impressions of reflection, or the ideas of sensation and the ideas of reflection, the difference between the two is really a difference of nature. Witness, for example, the following quotation. For that is necessary to produce a new idea of reflection, nor can the mind, by revolving over 1,000 times all its ideas of sensation, ever extract from them any new original idea, unless nature has so framed its faculties that it feels some new original impression arise from such a contemplation. The impressions of sensation are only the origin of the mind. As for the impressions of reflection, they are the qualification of the mind and the effect of principles in it. The point of view of the origin, according to which every idea derives from a pre-existing impression and represents it, does not have the importance that people attribute to it. It merely gives the mind a simple origin and frees the ideas from the obligation of having to represent things, and also from the corresponding difficulty of having to understand the resemblance of ideas. The real importance is on the side of the impressions of reflection, because they are the ones which qualify the mind as subject. The essence and the destiny of empiricism are not tied to the atom, but rather to the essence of association. Therefore, empiricism does not raise the problem of the origin of the mind, but rather the problem of the constitution of the subject. Moreover, it envisages this constitution in the mind as the effect of transcending principles and not as the product of a genesis. The difficulty is in establishing a specific relation between the two meanings of idea or impression, or between origin and qualification. We have already seen their difference. It is the same difference that Hume encounters under the form of an antinomy of knowledge. It defines the problem of the self. The mind is not subject, it is subjected. When the subject is constituted in the mind under the effect of principles, the mind apprehends itself as a self, for it is being qualified. But the problem is this: if the subject is constituted only inside the collection of ideas, how can the collection of ideas be apprehended as a self? How can I say I under the influence of those same principles? We do not really understand how we can move from dispositions to the self, or from the subject to the self. How can the subject and the mind, in the last analysis, be one and the same inside the self? The self must be both a collection of ideas and a disposition, mind and subject. It is a synthesis, which is incomprehensible, since it ties together in its notion, without ever reconciling them, origin and qualification. In short, there are two principles, which I cannot render consistent, nor is it in my powers to renounce either of them, viz., that all our distinct perceptions are distinct existences, and that the mind never perceives any real connection among distinct existences. Hume, in fact, adds that a solution may be possible. We will see later on what sense we can give to this hope. Human nature is the real object of science, but Hume's philosophy presents us with two modalities of this nature and with two types of affection. We are faced, on the one hand, with the effects of association, and on the other with the effects of passion. Each one of them determines a system, the system of understanding and the system of passions and ethics. But what is their relation? To begin with, between the two, A kind of parallelism seems to be established and followed exactly. Belief and sympathy correspond. Moreover, everything that belongs to sympathy and goes beyond belief is, according to the analysis, analogous to that which the passions add to the association of ideas. On another plane, just as association fixes in the mind a necessary generality, that is, a rule which is indispensable to theoretical knowledge, in the same way the passions provide the mind with the content of a constancy, make possible a practical and moral activity, and give history its meaning. Without this double movement, there would not even be a human nature, for the imagination would be mere fancy. The points of correspondence do not stop there. The relation between motive and action is of a piece with causality, to the point that history must be construed as a physics of humanity. Finally, in the case of the determination of nature, and in the case of the constitution of a world of morality, general rules, being both extensive and corrective, have the same sense. We should not identify the system of understanding with theory, and the system of morality and the passions with practice. Under the name of belief, we have a practice of this understanding, and under the form of social organization and justice, a theory of morality. Moreover, everywhere in Hume, the only possible theory is a theory of practice. With respect to the understanding, we have the calculation of probabilities and general rules. With respect to morality and the passions, we have general rules and justice. Important as they may be, however, all these correspondences are the mere presentation of philosophy and the distribution of its results. The relation of analogy between the two constituted domains should not make us forget which one of them determines the constitution of the other as philosophical matter. We actually seek the motive of philosophy. At least the fact is easy to decide. Hume is, above all, a moralist, a political thinker, and a historian. But why? The treatise begins with the system of understanding, and raises the problem of reason. However, the necessity of such a problem is not obvious. It must have an origin, which we can consider as a motive of this philosophy. It is not because reason solves problems that it is itself a problem. On the contrary, for reason to experience a problem in its own domain, there must be a domain that escapes reason, putting it initially into question. The important and principal sentence of the treatise is this: "'Tis not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger." Contrariety is an excessive relation. Reason can be put into question and can raise the problem of its nature, because it does not apply to all there is. The fact is that it does not determine practice. It is practically or technically insufficient. Undoubtedly, reason influences practice to the extent that it informs us of the existence of a thing as the proper object of a passion, or to the extent that it reveals a connection between causes and effects as means of satisfaction. But we cannot say that reason produces an action, that passion contradicts it, or even that reason thwarts a passion. Contradiction implies at least a disagreement between ideas and the objects which the ideas represent. A passion is an original existence, or, if you will, modification of existence, and contains not any representative quality, which renders it a copy of any other existence or modification. Moreover, moral distinctions do not let themselves be engendered through reason. They arouse passions and produce or hinder action. There is indeed contradiction in misappropriating properties and in violating promises, but only to the extent that promises and properties exist in nature. Reason can always be brought to bear, but it is brought to bear on a pre-existing world, and presupposes an antecedent ethics and an order of ends. Thus, it is because practice and morality are in their nature, and not in their circumstances, indifferent to reason, that reason seeks its difference. Because it is negated from the outside, it is denied from the inside, and discovered as madness and skepticism. Furthermore, because this skepticism has its origin and its motive on the outside, in the indifference of practice, practice itself is indifferent to skepticism. We can always play backgammon. The philosopher behaves as anyone else. The characteristic of the skeptic is that her or his reasoning does not allow a reply, and at the same time does not produce conviction. We are, therefore, brought back to the previous conclusion, and this time we find it completed. Skepticism and positivism are mutually implied by the same philosophical reasoning. The positivism of the passions and ethics produces a skepticism of reason. This internalized skepticism, having become a skepticism of reason, causes a positivism of the understanding as the theory of a practice. This positivism of the understanding is conceived in the image of the skepticism of reason. According to the image, yes, but not according to the resemblance. We can now understand exactly the difference between the system of ethics and the system of the understanding. In the case of the affect, we must distinguish two terms, passional or moral affection, and transcendence, as I mentioned, of knowledge. Without a doubt, the principles of morality, that is, the original and natural qualities of the passions, transcend and affect the mind, just as the principles of association do. The empirical subject is firmly constituted in the mind by the combined effects of all principles, but it is only under the unequal influence of the principles of association, not of the others, that this subject can transcend the given. It believes. In this precise sense, transcendence is exclusively the affair of knowledge. It carries the idea beyond itself, giving it a role, affirming its object and constituting its links. It follows that in the system of the understanding, the most important principle which affects the mind will first of all be studied in activity, that is, in the movement of a subject that transcends the given. The nature of the causal relation is grasped in the context of the inference. But the case of ethics is completely different, even when it takes analogically the form of the exposition of transcendence. There is no inference to be drawn in this case. We do not infer a character to be virtuous because it pleases, but in feeling that it pleases after such a particular manner, we in effect feel that it is virtuous. Ethics admits the idea as a factor only of the relevant circumstances and accepts the association as a constituted element of human nature. In the system of the understanding, on the other hand, association is a constitutive element, in fact, the only constitutive element of human nature. As an illustration of this duality, it is enough to remember Hume's distinction between two selves and the different way in which he presents and handles the corresponding problems. Thus, there are two kinds of practice which are immediately marked by very distinctive characteristics. The practice of the understanding determines the internal economy of nature and proceeds by means of extension. Nature, the object of physics, is partes extra partes. That is its essence. If we consider objects from the point of view of their idea, it is possible for all objects to become causes or effects on each other, since the causal relation is not one of their qualities. From a logical point of view, anything could be the cause of anything. But if, on the other hand, we observe the conjunction of two objects, each of the numerically different cases which presents the conjunction is independent of the other. Neither has influence over the other. They are entirely divided by time and place. They are the only component parts of a certain probability. In fact, if probability presupposes causality, the certainty which is born of causal reasoning is also a limit and a particular case of probability, or rather the practically absolute convergence of probabilities. Nature is indeed an extensive magnitude, and as such, it lends itself to physical experiment and measurement. The essential thing is to determine the parts, and, within the realm of knowledge, this is the function of general rules. Nature is not a whole. The whole can no more be discovered than it can be invented. Totality is just a collection. I answer that the uniting of these parts into a whole is performed merely by an arbitrary act of the mind and has no influence on the nature of things. The general rules of knowledge, insofar as their generality concerns the whole, are not different from the human principles of our understanding. The difficulty, says Hume, is not in inventing, but rather in applying them. The case of the practice of morality, however, is different. Here the parts are given immediately, without any inference required, and without any necessary application. But instead of being extensive, these parts are mutually exclusive. They are not made up of parts, partiels, as in the case of nature. They are rather partial, partiels. In the ethical practice, the difficulty is in diverting and slanting that partiality. The important thing here is to invent. Justice is an artificial virtue, and man is an inventive species. The essential task is to constitute a whole of morality. For justice is a schema, and the schema is the very principle of society. A single act of justice, considered in itself, may often be contrary to the public good, and 'tis only the concurrence of mankind, in a general scheme or system of action, which is advantageous. The question is no longer about transcendence, but rather about integration. Unlike reason, which always proceeds from one part to another, feeling reacts to wholes. This is why, in the domain of ethics, general rules have a different meaning.